All right, welcome back, everybody. Good morning. My name is Amanda Johnston. I'm a managing attorney at Gardner Law, and I am going to talk about submissions. So everyone's a fun topic, FDA submissions. And I won't bore you with my bio, but I've been doing FDA submissions for 10 years. So I have, over 100. I don't keep count anymore, but lots of different types of submissions, drugs, devices, annual reports, change control, all that fun stuff. So we'll talk about tips and tricks, and we'll get into it. So we're going to talk through kind of steps to a successful submission. And we'll try to throw in some anecdotes about, kind of what works, what doesn't work, what we've seen, what I've seen over the years. We'll talk about enforcement mechanisms. So, after you get a clearance or approval, kind of what things to continue paying attention to. And then we'll also wrap up with just some more tips and best practices. All right, so a lot of the times we'll get clients that will come to us and they'll say, okay, I need to submit a 510K, like here you go, here's our device. And, we'll say, okay, we'll have to make sure that the classification is correct, you're submitting the right type of submission, do you have your design history file done, like all these kind of things wrapped up, and they'll say, what's that? So just wanted to kind of walk through what the steps should look like, or ideally would look like. So really, this should happen early on in the device development process. We should be thinking about, what does the device do? What do we want to say about the device? And then also just things that we don't want to forget kind of in those discussions. So when you're designing the device, look at the intended use, which Jesse and Nate talked about. Indications for use, as you know, that's critical as you market your device, and that limits kind of what you can say and what you can't say. And that does come into play from an enforcement perspective as well. So what do you want to say about it? So everything that goes in your labeling, you'll submit that to FDA as well, and there may be some back and forth, but just having kind of a clear, agreement amongst the team on what you want in the labeling and what you want to say about the device, so that what you want to say actually makes it into the labeling. And then, most importantly, marketing claims. So what are your sales reps going to say? What do you want them to say about it? What do you not want them to say about your product? And just some things so you don't forget these considerations, but again, like thinking ahead about desired claims, and then limitations on claims that can be made based on your indications and labeling and what's in your label. Voice of business. So a lot of the times we'll see companies, not have the planning ahead of time when it comes to reimbursement, which can be, a huge challenge once you do all the work, you get clearance, you get approval, you launch your product, and then you realize that there's no reimbursement. So that can be a challenge. And a lot of the times reimbursement will tie back to the intended use or the indications for use. So just making sure that you're kind of thinking about all these things, and you have a team that's at least focused on the different aspects. Legal, IP, marketing, we want clinical involved as well. Business strategies, so thinking of competitors and just the industry, and kind of thinking of all those things as you're defining your device first, before we kind of jump ahead to the submission piece. And then, of course, patients and users, that should be kind of the voice of customer consideration going into your device and submission. All right, so step 2, regulatory classification. So I think step 1 and step 2 are probably done in parallel a lot of the time, but just kind of for sake of steps here, we'll talk about classification next. So you want to make sure you get this right. As a lot of you know, there's 3 classes of devices. They are risk-based, so class 1, class 2, class 3, and what class you fall in dictates the submission type, and then also kind of what controls you need to have in place, from special controls, whether it's special controls or general controls. There's a lot of different device types, and I don't know if you guys have looked through the database, but some of them are very similar, and they just have nuanced differences in the definition. So it's really important to do kind of your homework on that classification database and try to figure out exactly where your device falls. And sometimes it won't fall perfectly in any. And we'll talk about some options when that scenario comes up. So yeah, I just put the FDA product classification database. I use that all the time. I'm a nerd, but I'm on that database probably every day. There is a 513G request for information process, so if you really are not sure how your device should be classified and you want to have that advanced discussion with FDA about it, there is a method for doing that. You submit and then you get feedback in return, and sometimes they'll say, we don't know, you might have to go to OCP, the Office of Combination Products, or they may say you'll have to, submit an RFD to CDER, for example, the drug branch. FDA also has an email address, which I don't think a lot of people know about, but it's DICE at FDA, and I think it's Division, Tim probably knows, Division of Industry Consumer Education, I think. You can email them, and they will write back. And I've actually had them call me back the same day. But it's intended to be a forum for just industry consumer questions. And so I have actually sent, I don't know, I've maybe 3 or 4 times in the last year, sent kind of informal emails about classification. And they've gotten back to me, and I think one time they called me back within an hour or 2. So they may not be able to give you firm, like, yes, you're good to go, but it is another avenue that I feel like not a lot of people know about. All right, so step 3. So let's say we've defined our device, we have determined our classification, and now we are writing the submission. So just a lot of this, maybe common sense, but I just want to highlight some reminders. So make sure you're using all the tools and resources that are available to you. There is a ton of guidance, and I still find guidance every day that I didn't know existed. There's just a lot out there. So make sure you're doing your homework, even it's Google or looking on the FDA website for guidance. Always follow the guidance if it's available, and if you're not going to, if you're choosing or electing to do something different, make sure you're putting that justification in the submission. Look at consensus standards. FDA has a lot of checklists for submissions that are very helpful because that should literally be your kind of guide as you're submitting or filling out your submission or completing it. Look at all the other device, so 510K summaries are a good example of, where you can kind of do your homework on competitors. And again, that's not the full 510K submission. I think that's a misconception is what's on the website. A 510K summary is not the entire submission of what they submitted to FDA. It's a summary. So, but that's also important to look at. You can usually get some good information about, what testing they did or kind of what strategies or what standards, that kind of thing. So that's really helpful as well. FDA has a ton of webinars, modules, kind of just go out there and see what you can find related to if you have specific questions. And that DICE email address would be a good resource as well if you have specific questions. We'll talk a little bit about pre-sub. So I feel like they get a bad rap. Everyone's always like, oh, we don't have time for a pre-sub. We just got to submit. We have to get it in, next month. But we'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of doing a pre-sub, but that's an option as well. And then there are some, I just wanted to mention that, of course, FDA has the Breakthrough Device Program and then the STEP program, which is similar. So just consider those. That would be done before you, submit your pre-market application. But it does give you kind of a little gold star from FDA's perspective. So theoretically, you should get some priority, a little bit more hand-holding in the process. And they do have a little bit more flexibility around having sprint discussions and pre-sub meetings. So that it is helpful. When you're, compiling the submission, there's different strategies that people take. Sometimes one person will write the whole submission and then, have people provide input. Other times, they'll break it up into different, quality takes this piece, software takes that piece, and then kind of compiling it together. There's not really a right way to do it. I would just caution that somebody reads through the entire submission and is able to kind of point out where there's gaps or questions and kind of make the story flow. And I do think of it like a story. When you're submitting and you have you're going through the device description, it should really flow like a story so that the audience, which is FDA, is able to kind of understand all the pieces, and they should be able to pick up sections, and it should make sense even if they haven't read the entire submission. Remember spelling, grammar, formatting, all those things, that all counts. We want it to look professional. We want to make it look like we are, competent and know what we're talking about. I've seen a lot of sloppy submissions. And I mean, I don't know. If I was FDA and I received, a submission with spelling errors and spacing is all wonky, it's an impression, and so we want to convey professionalism and expertise and competence. So just reminder. Um, Use their checklist. So like, for example, the 510K refuse to accept checklist. Use that, have it literally next to you as you're writing the submission and then as you're, creating the e-copies. All right. And then just kind of a quick overview, and this is a kind of in order of, fastest to longest in terms of device pathways to market. But yeah, exempt devices, so those that would not require a 510K. We have the EUA, which has kind of been hot the last couple of years, but it's been around for a long time. The 510K, and then the de novo and the PMA. So you can kind of see how the days get longer and longer as we get more complicated, and so does the user fee. So I just updated those, and I can't believe, what is the PMA at? 374. That's crazy. But yeah, this just gives you an idea of kind of what it looks like. All right, so I'll touch quickly on just a couple of the submission types. Many of you are probably familiar with them, but we'll chat about them quick. So a 510K, it's also called a pre-market notification. So it's mainly for Class 2 devices, some Class 1 devices, just a few that we've run into. But essentially, you're demonstrating that your device is as safe and effective as a predicate device that is already on the market. And it could have been cleared on its own 510K, or it could be a de novo device. But you're essentially demonstrating substantial equivalence. That's kind of the key term, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. 510Ks have a 90-day review period, so they're usually, typically when companies, have a device, they want a 510K because it's quicker. But there are, some advantages and disadvantages with having a 510K versus a PMA or doing a de novo, and we can talk about that as well. So it's 90 days, but the FDA review clock will stop if there are issues. So if there's deficiencies, we'll talk a little bit about some of the acronyms that come up with deficiencies, but the clock stops and you want to respond quickly so that you can get the clock started again. All right, and then there are special controls guidance documents that cover certain device types. So again, just make sure you're considering those and reviewing them as you're putting your submission together. All right, so what is substantial equivalence? So I pasted the actual text here, but we won't read it all. But essentially, we want to prove that our device, if we're trying to prove substantial equivalence in a 510K, that it either has the same, so we want to either prove that it has the same intended use and has the same technological characteristics, or it has different technological characteristics, but the data submitted demonstrates that your device is as safe and effective as the predicate device and does not raise different questions of safety and effectiveness. It's a mouthful, but essentially it's an either or, and honestly, it's usually the two on here where there's a little bit of a difference, but we're trying to demonstrate through submission of data and testing that there is no new question of safety or effectiveness. So just a refresher. All right, and then I had mentioned, sometimes you'll look in the product classification database and you won't find a good match for your device. And this is especially true for novel devices or devices that, there may be a predicate that kind of fits, but it's, we can't overcome that no question of safety or effectiveness threshold. And so then the de novo classification process is one of the options that's available to us. So in the absence of having a device classified, FDA automatically classifies it as a Class 3 device. So if you have a brand new product type that FDA has never considered, they're going to say it's a Class 3 and you'll have to submit, you can't market it. So the de novo classification process is actually the manufacturer submitting a request to FDA, asking them to reclassify your device as a Class 1 or 2. And so as part of that process, there's some negotiations in creating the special controls because they would actually create a new regulatory classification for you. So it would be specific to the product type or your device type. And so if they do grant it, you can market the device, and then it actually does create a new classification type for that product. One thing to note, and there is some kind of strategy that you can use in de novos. It's kind of nice because you are setting the stage for future competitors that come along. Future competitors can use your device as a predicate, so that's, it kind of reduces the barrier to entry from that perspective for competitors, but they would have to meet all the special controls that you helped establish. So yeah, let's see, is there anything else? Yeah, so if they decline and if they say, no, we're not gonna accept your de novo classification request, it remains class 3 and you'll have to probably seek out either a 513G or have, pre-subs with FDA to try to figure out how to submit it if it's a PMA. All right. Okay, we'll talk about pre-subs. And again, I think I mentioned a lot of people are like, nope, don't have time for that. It's a waste of time. I have to submit tomorrow or yesterday. But I just wanted to kind of talk through some of the advantages and disadvantages with doing a pre-sub. So you'll want to make sure that you have specific actionable questions for FDA. So, asking open-ended questions is probably not a good tactic to throw to FDA. If you do that, they'll probably send you back a ton of information or feedback, but it may not be helpful and it may not be what you're looking for. And then also you're stuck with having to address all of these questions that they raise, and you feel like you're obligated to close out some of those. So make sure, if you do a pre-sub, and there are certain questions that are, really helpful for pre-subs that are focused, specific, actionable. I like to think of like the SMART goals type of things. So just making sure that you're thinking about what types of questions would be good and what probably would not be as beneficial. It's a good opportunity, it can be a good opportunity to get some, informal buy-in from FDA. It creates a record with FDA so that you have, an official, you have meeting minutes, you have a submission and feedback that you can, use as you proceed down the path to pre-market submission. It's a good chance to interact with, usually it's typically the reviewer that you'll probably work with in the future, or at least they'll be involved, or that branch. So it is a good opportunity to just, get on the phone with them, get some feedback. A lot of the times you can sneak in questions or little things that you may want to get across, but didn't want to specifically include a full question on it. It depends on the reviewer. I was just part of a pre-sub a couple weeks ago, and it was incredibly helpful. Like, we wrapped up our questions, and she was willing to entertain, multiple off-topic questions. And she was just kind of like, yeah, you can't quote me on this, but I'll give you my feedback. So it is just that part of it is really helpful. There's no user fees, so that's nice. You don't have to pay for it in terms of submitting money to FDA for that. And then if you use it properly and you're scoping your questions properly, it probably will save time and money in the future if you're going down one path and then you change decisions based on the feedback from FDA. But again, you want to make sure your questions are scoped such that you're getting feedback from them that will help you make decisions on paths forward. If you just ask open-ended questions and they give you a bunch of other questions back, that really doesn't help you, and so that probably won't save time and money in the future. I really like that you get written feedback and you can have the teleconference rather than one or the other. I've never opted to forego a teleconference. I would always encourage to take them up on that. Even if it's one question and they answered it, I would still try to get that time with them. All right, disadvantages. I mean, people always say, I don't have time, we want to submit yesterday. It's going to take 60 days to get a meeting scheduled, that kind of thing. But it is something that I would encourage teams to think about early on in the process so that they can budget time for it. Because FDA, they do like pre-subs if they have time for them. With COVID, We've seen, sometimes they've been denying them or just saying like, sorry, we don't have time, but I still would encourage companies to try to get in front of FDA for a pre-sub. Even just doing that and showing them, then they'll have the submission, so that's helpful. Some other disadvantages, it doesn't always resolve all your questions. It doesn't always, answer everything you're looking for. And a lot of the times with their feedback will be qualified, as in like, hey, this looks good, but we'll have to see the data first. Or, this is not binding, but here's our feedback, or here are things to consider. So it's not always like yes or no. Actually, it's never yes or no. They usually say that looks reasonable, or that appears to be reasonable testing strategy or something like that. So yeah, along the lines, feedback is not binding. It's not. They can change their mind. It's tougher for them to change their mind because then we can bring up, hey, look at these meeting minutes. You said X, Y, Z, and now you're changing your mind. Like, why is that? But again, it is not binding, so it's just something to consider. Teleconferences are typically limited to 1 hour. I don't know if I've had any recently that have been more than an hour. We've tried, and they just say, nope, sorry. But I might as well give it a shot and ask for an hour and a half or 2 hours if it's lengthy questions. And then just another disadvantage is it's limited in scope, number of questions and topics. So you can't just put 20 questions down. I think in their guidance they say like 2 or 3 or 1 to 3, which I think is a good amount for an hour teleconference, especially if it's really deep subject matter. Maybe limit it to 1 question. All right, so we've defined our device, we've submitted a pre-sub, had a discussion, we've classified, and now we have put our submission together and we are going to submit. So these are just kind of logistical things, but can't have to mention them. So make sure you remember to pay the user fees. This actually gets forgotten sometimes, and then we're like, oh wait, did you pay? It's kind of an administrative step, but they won't accept it unless you pay the user fee. So it will delay it if you submit it first, and then then the user fee gets submitted. So just a reminder, if you'd like to take advantage of the small business program, which if you aren't familiar with that, FDA has a small business designation program. You submit some tax records. I think it's like 100 million or less in revenue is a small business according to FDA. So you get lower user fees. So it actually does save quite a bit of money. I think I had the small business fees on the chart, so you can go back and take a look too. But yeah, 510Ks go from 13,000 down to 3,000 for a small business. So it's something to think about if you're eligible. It does take time. It takes about 60 days to get approved. So just make sure if you're going to do that, submit in advance so that you have that. The e-copy process. I don't know how many of you have actually done the e-copy process. It can be challenging. So when I worked in industry, we had a regulatory operations team, and I did not realize how helpful they were for a lot of these logistical administrative things. It took them for granted, and now I want to go back and thank them for helping with all that, because it can be really tricky. I've had some e-copy holds because my USB had hidden files on it. Now I have a process down, but it can be tricky. So it's not something you want to start the day of submission. It's something that you'll want to probably practice and try a couple times. And you do literally still, they call it e-copy, but you have to burn it onto a disk and then go to the UPS. And so it's not really electronic, I'll say that. But and they will they'll put you on an e-copy hold if it's not done properly. So it is something that you'll want to think about. And then once it's we sent it, we did our e-copy validation tool, so everything looks good. They accepted it at FDA. Submissions will go into an administrative review or an acceptance review, and that's when they're looking to make sure that it is administratively complete. So they have all the elements they need to actually start the substantive review. It's usually 15 calendar days. I think it's 15 for 510Ks. And then once you pass that, you'll go into the substantive interactive review, and that's where there's some back and forth typically. Sometimes they'll move you from, if I'm trying to think of scenarios, but they'll move you into interactive review, and so then it's theoretically, there's more interaction versus just sending information. Interactive is more kind of like a real-time, trying to resolve questions quicker. I don't know if any of you have used the new submission tracking portal that FDA has. It's pretty cool. I mean, it helps you count days, basically, so you don't have to sit with your calendar anymore. But it is pretty nifty. And just some things to consider, while your submission is under, on FDA's desk and they're reviewing it, try not to take risks in the marketplace. Don't start promoting. FDA will probably Google your company and your product, and so if you have your website, already, published, that could pose problems for the review. And so just, that's a time to kind of stay under the radar still and just kind of stay the course until you hear from FDA. And it's likely that you will get questions, deficiencies. I'm trying to think of if I've had any submissions recently without questions or deficiencies. I mean, it's just almost standard that you'll get at least some questions. May not be deficiencies, but could be, additional information, letters, stuff like that. So don't be surprised. That's very typical. Although I think, Nate, you got one without questions, didn't you, recently? Yes. I know, it's always like, it's fun when that happens, but. Okay, just some alphabet soup on things that we hear back from FDA on 510Ks. So RTA, if you hear that lingo, that has to do with the refuse to accept checklist, which again, I referenced the checklist earlier. So if FDA reviews your submission, and again, this is kind of the acceptance review before they start looking at the content, and they decide it's not complete from an administrative perspective, which means you probably missed something on the checklist, they will send you an RTA letter, which is the checklist with some explanations, telling you what is missing, and you want to respond to that as quickly as possible. Again, you'll have to do an e-copy, so that's timed, so think about that. Again, another reason why the checklists are so important. You want to make sure you have everything covered so that you can avoid that back and forth. AI letter is a request for additional information. So this is while you're in the actual substantive review. So you're in the substantive review. They have questions about really substantial equivalence or any of the data that you submitted. So once they've actually looked at it, they may come back with questions. If you get an AI letter, it's on hold, the submission is, until you respond back to them. And they usually give you 180 days, which it seems like a long time, but sometimes, depending on what they're asking for, they could be asking for new testing. And so then it's kind of trying to figure out if that's possible. And then NSE and SE. So SE is substantial equivalence. So you'll get either an NSE letter or an SE letter. If NSE means basically they did not find your product to be substantially equivalent, that's considered final action. So your submission is closed. So then you're forced to try to figure out, do we submit a de novo? Again, you're kind of going through the pre-sub route. Again, why it's so important to really get that classification and the submission pathway right the first time. All right. So these are just continued compliance, and Nate and Jesse talked about this extensively, so I will not repeat, but just kind of follow the rules, make sure you're staying in the clear once you have clearance and approval. Because if, as Nate and Jesse talked about, if you're not following the rules, FDA will, probably deem your device to be misbranded or adulterated. And then the enforcement mechanisms. So I listed out, everything, but really all of them are business disruptors, and all of them are probably going to disrupt sales and marketing and regulatory. There's a lot of really bad things on here, but even, a 483 or a warning letter, that's a huge deal for a company, and from a PR perspective as well. So just things to think about. All right, so we're down to kind of best practices and tips, and I try to distill it, but I have a ton of information that I was trying to convey here. So if I, feel free to come up to me during lunch or breaks if you want to chat about submissions. I know, nerdy, but so again, get the classification and the submission type right. Get a second opinion. if you need to. We have, a lot of clients come to us that, they're pretty sure, but they want us to do a second look, and then we'll, prepare a memo for them so that they can have it. They may use some of that justification for a pre-sub or a 513G. Really study the paths and submissions for similar products. So sometimes you'll have a same kind of type of product, but it will be in different buckets. Like we had a situation where there were like 5 product codes that it could have been, and we're trying to figure out, strategically which one works best, but then also from a business perspective, what do we want if there's some leeway there. So really putting the time into kind of doing your homework on those paths and find the most appropriate predicate. Again, that's a big deal. So we want to get that right. And if we're not sure, we can ask FDA too. Consider using the pre-sub process. It may save time and cost in the end, especially if we're, focusing our questions, being strategic about what we're asking. Read and follow guidance as closely as possible. If you deviate, provide an explanation up front. So that shows both that you have, you read the guidance, you understand FDA told you to do something and you're not doing it, and so you want to explain why, because that will eliminate a question. And hopefully they will agree with your justification, but if not, at least it shows that you proactively thought about it. Don't make FDA ask for something. I feel like this kind of comes up as a submission strategy where you just throw it over the wall and kind of just hope that they don't ask. They usually do. And so just, thinking a comprehensive submission, if you think they're going to ask or if you know it's required, submit it. Don't make them ask. And I know there is some kind of strategy with like testing, for example. Sometimes we'll submit at risk waiting for testing, or they'll be doing testing at the same time, kind of knowing that FDA might ask for it. That's, definitely a discussion that can be had, but if it's something that's plainly required, I would not recommend leaving it out. Again, e-copies, find somebody who knows what they're doing. It's not something you want to do the day of submission. Working collaboratively with your team and FDA. So if you get questions and, you have to go to team members to ask, like say it's a clinical question and you have to go to clinical, don't show, I'm trying to think of a good way to say this. Like sometimes there's like disagreement amongst the team, and we want to be very clear with FDA that, you're on the same team and you're trying to help FDA do their job. So just being collaborative with both your team and whoever's, on the email chain and communications and FDA. Try not to be defensive. They may be asking questions that you think are ridiculous, but, try to just, again, we want professionalism, experts. We want to be viewed as being, obviously competent and calm, rational people. So if issues come up, so this, if there's an impasse or disagreement, this has come up a lot lately, especially with just timing with COVID, and timing is more of the essence when they're already delayed on things. But work with the reviewer as much as you can. Some are better than others about being flexible and accommodating and kind of going into that interactive review. Escalate to management as needed. So if you're really not getting anywhere with the reviewer or the review team, you kind of escalate. Make sure you're keeping email communications and kind of notes from when you called or tried to call. That's helpful. Using the ombudsman. So we've actually used the ombudsman quite a bit lately, just with timing and helping with that kind of thing. They're helpful in that they go and they talk and then they come back and give us an update, but they're not going to make any decisions for you. They're not going to, magically, solve the problem. And then if you really are at an impasse, and again, there's an appeal process, but it's only on final action. So you can explore requests for supervisory review. There's the CFR. It's a process, but it is if you truly have an issue that you think needs to be appealed, and this would be a final action, so what an NSE letter, an SE letter, a not approved letter, there is a pathway for that. All right, and I'm wrapping up really quickly. Watch outs. So again, failing to submit or submitting inadequate documentation. So again, if you don't have any design controls, probably don't submit. FDA is going to come back and issue an AI letter. Don't delay in responding to FDA questions. Try to get back to them as quickly as possible. Usually they ask for a quick turnaround, like 1 or 2 days. So just be mindful of that. While it's under review, having a plan for who's out of office and who could respond if needed. Yeah, just watch out. So if there's no suitable predicate, if there's product code issues. Again, e-copy process. Can you tell I have the e-copy process? I've had some struggles. Planning for ongoing regulatory support. So, once the submission goes in, you get approved, you clear. Unfortunately, it doesn't end there. There's change control, there's annual reports, there's, MDRs, there's lots of things that you need ongoing regulatory support for. So continue to, plan for that, have somebody available. And you probably will have to submit a new 510K and down the road. Rushing submissions is not a good strategy, and that just goes back to kind of thinking through getting it right the first time and avoiding delays. On the topic of delays, so we're still seeing COVID delays. With pre-subs and the DUFA guidelines, I think it's a lot of, it's still a thing. I'm hopeful that it will, eventually start to get better, but for now, and there's not much you can do, unfortunately. So unless it's, you could use the ombudsman and try to get it hurried up, but they'll just say, sorry, we're short on resources. So and so got reassigned, so it's being prioritized. Is basically how they respond. So, all right, that is all I have. Any questions?
Yeah, so a quick question from online. Are pre-subs or pre-sub requests on the public record? And then if they are, what if they want to stay off the radar of potential competitors?
They are not, am I on? They are not public record. So they could submit a FOIA request, a competitor could, but that takes a long time, and then it potentially would be redacted, or you get a chance to redact it. But no, they're not public record. Yeah. So jump over there. Sorry, he's going to get the mic.
I'm sorry. So, just a quick one. I'm struggling with something for the client, right?
Okay.
All we need is pre-sub. I'm like, you don't need one? I can't see what specific question you want to ask.
Yeah.
There's a predicate I could use and have an additional feature.
Okay.
Right? But there's no great reference device. And so I'm like, but I know what they would ask you to want to see, so I think we'll try the 510K. And how many times have you run into that? Because I don't want to tell them they have to.
Often actually.
Or
people
do a de novo.
Exactly.
I wouldn't recommend either.
Yeah, some people. I think some companies, which is I don't know which is better. I think they assume you have to do a pre-sub. And no, you don't. Don't do it if you don't have specific questions that you need FDA's feedback in order to make a decision on next steps. So. Yeah, there's always that kind of weighing, do we just go for the 510K and take the questions then, or do we have truly actionable questions that we need feedback on before we can move ahead? So I run into the same thing, and it really is kind of a business, how much risk are they willing to tolerate, kind of what their timeline is, that kind of thing. Oh, more.
You had up the timeline for the devices for 510Ks, PMAs. Do you have that data for NDAs and BLAs?
I don't here, but I do at my office. You can email me. We also have a database that is awesome. I don't know if any of you use Basil, but they have real-time review timelines, which is awesome. I'll put in a plug for that system because it's awesome. Yeah.
One thing that happened recently for us is COVID actually had a benefit for us because we didn't know. A reviewer that we were working with hinted just as we were approaching 180 days and the client didn't have everything finished.
Yeah.
And we were facing the Grim Reaper.
Yes.
So I had called the reviewer to talk about something else. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, contact the 510K program office because I understand they're still giving extensions for COVID.
Oh.
So
okay.
almost at the 180-day
Yep.
mark.
Okay.
They gave us another 180
Wow. Okay.
on a 510K. But I don't know how long that door is going to stay
Sure.
open.
Okay, that's really good to know. I haven't had that situation come up yet, but
There's a
okay.
guidance about COVID.
Yep.
And when they withdraw that guidance, they are
Got
going
it.
to withdraw the 180-day
Okay.
extension option.
Thank you. That's helpful. Good to know. Yeah, not many benefits, but that's a good one. So you don't have to go start from scratch again. Anything else, or are we good?
Should one follow and apply draft FDA guidances?
Good question. Yes, yes, they should.
If your product is class 1, is the submission process still necessary?
So it would depend again. I mean, we'd have to see how it was classified. Some class 1 devices require a 510K. You'd have to look and see what that product code requires. So there's not a hard and fast rule there. But I'd say the majority of class 1 do not require a 510K. You'd have to look at the classification.
And final one for this session, for a PMA product, what mechanisms are available, level of evidence needed to get approval to make a new efficacy claim? For example, long-term data with on-label patients shows memory improvement.
Oh, that's a specific one.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can weigh in on that specifically. It will probably need to be something that would be submitted and added to the labeling if there's data. So it'd probably be a PMA supplement, whether it's, I don't know, real-time review, what are the other ones, 180. Yeah, I don't know, that's kind of I don't know if you have any thoughts, Dave.
I think that oftentimes that's where a pre-sub is
Yeah,
almost most
yeah.
helpful, is because you can go to FDA and say, I want to make this specific claim.
Yep.
And then they can say, okay, like, what's your study? And you can kind of work with FDA.
Yep.
And FDA really likes to help design clinical studies. So the one thing is, if you think you might disagree, once it's in front of FDA,
Yeah.
you're going to be kind of beholden to that. But that is a really good pre-sub mechanism, is to have a good discussion on, I want to make X claim. Will these data get me that claim? So,
Okay.
all right, thank you.